From Europe rose a global shadow, flags planted across distant unfamiliar lands. Empire expanded quietly through ambition alone. History felt its approaching weight worldwide. One of history's largest colonial empires. Territory measured power beyond borders alone. Control meant resources, influence, prestige global. Scale itself became strategic weapon global. It spanned 5 continents simultaneously worldwide. Africa, Asia, Americas, Europe, Pacific Islands. Oceans connected distant administrative centers globally. Maps redrawn by French ambition alone. Beginnings trace back 16th century Europe. Sailors, merchants, missionaries followed royal orders. Trading posts evolved into colonies overseas. Expansion started cautiously, then accelerated rapidly. Empire reached peak modern industrial age. 19th century pushed borders outward aggressively. 20th century maintained vast holdings worldwide. Administration stretched thin across territories abroad. Colonial rule, mixed culture, control, exploitation. Language, law, education spread French influence. Infrastructure served empire economic needs primarily. Local resistance simmered beneath order imposed. Britain stood as greatest imperial rival. Competition spanned seas, markets, colonies worldwide. Wars, treaties shaped shifting dominance repeatedly. Global balance depended on colonial strength. World wars weakened colonial foundations severely. Occupation cost resources, legitimacy, manpower rapidly. Subscribe to our channel for more insights. Explore history, culture, and global connections. Join us in understanding past and present. Stay updated, informed, and inspired every day. France sought roots beyond European dominance. Francis I challenged Iberian supremacy. Exploration symbolized ambition, curiosity, and royal vision. New horizons promised wealth, prestige, and influence. Francis encouraged voyages, despite limited naval resources. He believed discovery strengthened monarchical authority. French explorers searched western passages to Asia. Competition motivated urgency against Spain and Portugal. Giovanni da Verrazzano led early expeditions. His voyages mapped Atlantic North American coasts. Reports described fertile lands promising opportunity. These findings encouraged further royal investment. Exploration aligned with Renaissance curiosity and science. Maps, navigation, and cartography rapidly improved. France aimed knowledge alongside territorial claims. Intellectual ambition accompanied imperial aspiration closely. Francis avoided direct conflict through cautious strategy. He authorized private expeditions under royal banners. Explorers claimed land symbolically for France. Ceremonies asserted sovereignty without permanent settlements. Early exploration prioritized reconnaissance over colonization. France gathered intelligence on coasts, rivers, peoples. Encounters with indigenous communities shaped perceptions. Alliances, trade, and diplomacy were tested. Financial constraints limited sustained overseas ventures. Wars in Europe diverted attention and funds. Still, exploration maintained symbolic imperial presence. Ambition persisted despite setbacks and delays. Francis viewed exploration as national prestige. Successful voyages enhanced France's global reputation. Reports circulated among court scholars and merchants. Curiosity about Western lands intensified greatly. Exploration laid foundations for future colonies. Knowledge gained reduced risks of settlement. Rivers, harbors, and climates were documented. These insights guided later colonial planning. Francis balanced ambition with diplomatic pragmatism. Treaties challenged papal divisions of oceans. France rejected monopolies claimed by rivals. Exploration asserted freedom of the seas. Royal patronage legitimized exploratory undertakings officially. Captains acted as agents of the crown. Flags, rituals, and proclamations marked claims. Authority traveled aboard ships across oceans. Exploration narratives shaped French national identity. Stories emphasized bravery, faith, and endurance. Chroniclers celebrated encounters, dangers, and discoveries. Myth-making strengthened support for overseas ambitions. Early voyages faced storms, disease, and uncertainty. Losses tempered enthusiasm, but not resolve. Experience accumulated with each expedition undertaken. Persistence defined Francis's exploratory policy clearly. Exploration connected France to Atlantic worlds. Networks of information trade slowly formed. Mariners returned with knowledge commodities specimens. Curiosity transformed into strategic opportunity gradually. Under Francis, exploration ignited imperial beginnings, though limited, its impact proved lasting. These voyages marked France's colonial entry. Foundations were set for expansion ahead. France shifted from exploration toward permanent settlement. North America appeared vast, fertile, and strategic. Rivers offered access deep into the continent. Colonization promised stability, influence, and trade. Samuel de Champlain emerged as key architect. He envisioned alliances rather than pure conquest. Diplomacy with indigenous nations shaped strategy. Cooperation enabled survival in harsh environments. In 1608, Quebec was founded strategically. Location controlled St. Lawrence River access. It became administrative and commercial center. New France gained a lasting foothold. Settlers faced extreme winters, unfamiliar climates. Agriculture adapted slowly to new conditions. Dependence on indigenous knowledge proved essential. Survival required resilience, cooperation, and patience. For trade drove early economic activity. Beaver pelts were highly valued in Europe. French traders partnered with native trappers. Commerce defined colonial priorities strongly. Missionaries accompanied settlers into frontier regions. Jesuits aimed to spread Christianity and influence. Religion intertwined with imperial expansion goals. Conversion efforts shaped cultural interactions. Population growth remained limited and controlled. France favored quality settlers over mass migration. Men outnumbered women, creating demographic imbalance. Royal policies later encouraged family settlement. Seigneurial system organized land distribution. Lords managed estates along riverbanks. Peasants farmed in long, narrow plots. This system mirrored French rural society. Military presence protected against rival powers. Fortifications guarded trade routes and settlements. Conflicts with Iroquois intensified periodically. Defense became constant colonial concern. Alliances defined survival and territorial control. French sided with Huron and Algonquin nations. These relationships shaped regional power dynamics. Warfare followed indigenous political rivalries. New France emphasized cultural integration over dominance. Intermarriage and alliances were relatively common. French identity adapted to frontier realities. Colonial society evolved uniquely overseas. Administration remained closely tied to the crown. Governors and intendants enforced royal authority. Centralized control limited local autonomy. Empire reflected absolutist governance models. Economic focus remained narrow and fragile. Agriculture lagged behind trade profitability. Dependence on fur created vulnerability. Diversification attempts met limited success. Rival English colonies grew rapidly nearby. Demographic imbalance weakened French influence. Territorial claims exceeded actual population presence. Competition intensified across North America. Despite challenges, New France endured centuries. Its culture, language, and legacy persisted. Foundations influenced modern Canadian identity. Colonial roots remain historically significant. French attention shifted toward the Caribbean islands. Climate favored profitable plantation agriculture. Small islands produced immense economic returns. Caribbean colonies became imperial priorities. Martinique and Guadeloupe were early acquisitions. France established control during 17th century. Islands served as strategic naval bases. They anchored French presence in the region. Saint-Domingue emerged as most valuable colony. Modern Haiti generated enormous sugar wealth. Plantations dominated landscapes and economies. Colony became France's richest possession. Sugar, coffee, and indigo drove expansion. European demand fueled relentless production growth. Plantations required vast labor forces. Profit eclipsed humanitarian considerations completely. Enslaved Africans formed majority populations. Transatlantic slave trade sustained labor supply. Human suffering underpinned colonial prosperity. Racial hierarchies structured colonial society. Plantation owners wielded immense local power. Wealth translated into political influence. Colonial elites shaped policies and governance. Economic interests overrode moral concerns. Ports connected islands to global trade. Goods flowed between Europe, Africa, Americas. Caribbean became hub of triangular trade. Empire thrived on interconnected exploitation. Harsh conditions produced frequent resistance. Enslaved people rebelled against brutal systems. Punishments attempted to suppress dissent. Tension remained constant across plantations. Colonial administrations enforced strict slave codes. Legal systems defined racial and social order. Human lives reduced to property status. Law institutionalized inequality and violence. Caribbean wealth financed French war's ambitions. Revenues supported navy in continental conflicts. Colonies became essential to state power. Economic dependency on slavery deepened. European rivals contested Caribbean dominance. Britain and Spain sought similar profits. Naval battles erupted across island chains. Territorial control frequently shifted through wars. Cultural blending occurred despite oppression. African traditions survived through music, religion. Creole identities emerged from forced coexistence. Caribbean culture evolved uniquely under empire. Missionaries attempted religious conversion efforts. Christianity was imposed alongside control. Spiritual practices blended under colonial pressure. Faith became tool and refuge simultaneously. Caribbean colonies symbolized imperial contradiction. Great wealth coexisted with extreme cruelty. Prosperity relied on systemic dehumanization. Moral costs were long ignored. Revolution eventually shattered colonial order. Saint-Domingue uprising transformed world history. It challenged slavery and imperial authority. Caribbean empire entered irreversible decline. French Caribbean legacy remains deeply complex. Economic foundations shaped global capitalism. Trauma continues within post-colonial societies. History echoes through modern Caribbean identities. French expansion followed commercial logic primarily. Trade promised wealth, influence, and stability. Empire functioned as economic engine. Power grew through controlled exchange networks. Mercantilism shaped French colonial policy. Colonies existed to enrich the metropole. Raw materials flowed toward France. Finished goods returned to colonies. State-supported chartered trading companies. Monopolies received royal protection and authority. Companies governed territories and populations. Profit and administration merged tightly. Ports became nodes of imperial control. Ships linked Africa, Asia, Americas, Europe. Maritime strength enabled economic dominance. Navy protected routes and interests. Trade justified territorial acquisition abroad. Strategic locations secured supply chains. Harbors, islands, rivers gained importance. Geography served commerce and power. Military force backed commercial ambitions. Fortresses guarded trade centers and routes. Violence enforced economic compliance. Empire relied on coercion when needed. Colonial administrators prioritized revenue extraction. Taxes, tariffs, and labor sustained systems. Local needs ranked secondary always. Efficiency outweighed welfare considerations. Asian trade attracted growing French interest. India offered textiles, spices, and prestige. Trading posts expanded into political footholds. Commerce slowly transformed into control. Competition pushed France toward aggressive expansion. Rivals threatened markets and access. Territory equaled bargaining power internationally. Empire became tool of diplomacy. Colonial labor systems maximized output. Enslavement, coercion, and taxation prevailed. Human cost ignored for productivity. Economic logic overruled ethical restraint. Infrastructure served trade more than settlers. Roads, ports, warehouses supported exports. Colonies designed for extraction primarily. Development favored imperial needs only. Wealth from trade strengthened state authority. Revenue funded armies, fleets, and courts. Colonies underwrote European ambitions. Global reach reinforced domestic power. Expansion reshaped global economic patterns. Markets integrated under imperial systems. Unequal exchange defined colonial relationships. Wealth accumulated unevenly across worlds. Resistance emerged against exploitative systems. Merchant settlers and natives protested controls. Smuggling undermined imperial monopolies. Tension accompanied commercial dominance. Trade-driven expansion proved ultimately fragile. Overextension strained finances and administration. Rivals adapted and challenged supremacy. Empire faced limits of economic imperialism. European rivalry shaped French imperial destiny. Empire grew within constant international competition. Colonies symbolized prestige, power, and survival. Global struggle defined colonial strategies. Britain emerged as France's primary rival. Both sought dominance across oceans. Naval power determined imperial success. Seas became battlegrounds for empires. Spain remained influential, though gradually declining. Earlier monopolies provoked French resistance. Treaties failed to prevent ongoing tensions. Colonial borders stayed fluid and contested. The Netherlands challenged French commercial interests. Dutch traders dominated early global trade. France sought to break their economic grip. Competition fueled naval and mercantile reforms. Colonial wars mirrored European conflicts abroad. Battles extended beyond continental battlefields. Overseas territories became war objectives. Empire expanded and contracted through treaties. 7 Years' War proved especially decisive. France lost major North American territories. Britain gained strategic colonial advantages. Balance of power shifted permanently. Rivalry forced military and administrative reforms. France strengthened navy and colonial defenses. Resources were stretched across multiple fronts. Overextension weakened long-term stability. Alliances with indigenous peoples became strategic. Native nations influenced imperial outcomes. France relied on diplomacy over population strength. Rivals used settler expansion aggressively. Economic competition intensified imperial pressure. Markets, resources, and trade routes mattered. Colonies represented wealth and leverage. Loss meant economic and political decline. Caribbean islands became highly contested prizes. Sugar wealth attracted constant naval attacks. Islands changed hands through warfare. Peace treaties often reversed victories. India witnessed rivalry between trading companies. French and British influence expanded inland. Commercial disputes evolved into military clashes. British dominance eventually prevailed. European diplomacy reshaped colonial maps. Treaties redrew borders without local consent. Colonies exchanged like political currency. Imperial subjects bore consequences silently. Competition fueled nationalism and imperial pride. Colonies symbolized national greatness. Public opinion supported overseas rivalry. Empire became matter of identity. Defeats exposed structural imperial weaknesses. Lower population limited French colonial strength. Economic reliance on few colonies proved risky. Rivals exploited these vulnerabilities effectively. Despite losses, France retained imperial ambition. Rivalry encouraged renewed expansion elsewhere. Africa and Asia gained attention later. Empire adapted rather than disappeared. European competition defined colonial rise-decline. Conflict accelerated imperial transformation. French Empire evolved through rivalry pressure. Global competition shaped its enduring legacy. French colonial governance relied on control mechanisms. Administration balanced authority, distance, and efficiency. Political systems varied across vast territories. Rule adapted to local conditions strategically. Direct rule imposed French laws institutions. Colonies governed as extensions of France. Local traditions were often suppressed. French culture dominated administrative life. Officials replaced indigenous leadership structures. Bureaucracy mirrored metropolitan governance models. Centralization ensured tight political oversight. Authority flowed directly from Paris. Indirect rule preserved selected local authorities. Traditional leaders governed under French supervision. This reduced administrative costs significantly. Control remained without full structural replacement. Indirect systems relied on cooperation compliance. Local elites enforced colonial policies. Power shared, but never equal. Ultimate authority stayed French always. Choice of system depended on colony. Population size influenced governance approach. Economic importance shaped political strategy. Resistance levels altered administrative decisions. Africa often experienced indirect rule models. France lacked manpower for direct control. Local chiefs became intermediaries. Colonial objectives achieved through delegation. Direct rule applied in settler colonies. Cultural transformation was primary goal. France aimed replication of institutions. Assimilation began through governance itself. Both systems served imperial dominance. Flexibility ensured long-term control. Administration adjusted without losing power. Colonial state remained authoritative. Legal systems reinforced political hierarchy. French law prioritized colonial interests. Justice favored European settlers consistently. Indigenous rights were marginal limited. Taxation enforced obedience and productivity. Economic obligations tied subjects to state. Failure meant punishment coercion. Administration relied on fiscal pressure. Education supported governance structures subtly. Schools trained clerks, interpreters, assistants. Curriculum promoted loyalty to France. Political control extended into classrooms. Military presence backed administrative authority. Force suppressed rebellion, ensured compliance. Governance relied on threat of violence. Stability maintained through power display. Communication networks strengthened central control. Reports traveled between colonies and Paris. Governors updated ministries regularly. Empire operated through information flow. Political systems evolved with experience. Failures prompted administrative adjustments. Experimentation defined colonial governance. Control remained constant objective. Direct and indirect rule shaped empire. Both reflected pragmatism over ideology. Administration prioritized dominance efficiency. French authority defined colonial political life. Governors represented French authority overseas. They acted as extensions of the state. Power concentrated in their offices. Colonial governance revolved around them. Governors were appointed directly from France. Selection reflected loyalty, experience, and status. They answered to ministries in Paris. Local accountability remained minimal. Military backgrounds were often preferred. Discipline ensured control and order. Force underpinned administrative authority. Governors commanded colonial troops. Civil administration fell under their oversight. They supervised taxation, justice, and policing. All major decisions required approval. Power remained highly centralized. Governors coordinated with colonial councils. Advisory bodies offered limited consultation. Final authority rested with governors. Local voices rarely influenced outcomes. Economic management formed key responsibility. Governors protected trade and production. Revenue generation remained primary objective. Economic stability justified strict governance. Relations with indigenous leaders were managed carefully. Governors negotiated alliances and compliance. Diplomacy reduced resistance costs. Cooperation supported indirect rule systems. In settler colonies, governors favored Europeans. Policies protected settler economic interests. Indigenous populations faced discrimination. Racial hierarchy guided administrative priorities. Governors enforced metropolitan policies locally. Laws, decrees, and reforms were implemented. Local adaptation remained limited. Uniformity symbolized imperial control. Communication with Paris shaped decision-making. Reports justified actions and requested guidance. Delays created autonomy in practice. Distance increased gubernatorial power. Corruption sometimes flourished under authority. Limited oversight encouraged personal enrichment. Abuses undermined colonial legitimacy. Reforms attempted to curb excesses. Governors balanced coercion with pragmatism. Harsh rule risked rebellion. Conciliation ensured longer stability. Authority required careful calculation. Crisis situations amplified gubernatorial power. Wars, revolts, emergencies centralized command. Normal procedures were suspended quickly. Security justified extraordinary measures. Tenure varied across colonies and eras. Some governors ruled briefly. Others shaped colonies for decades. Personal style influenced colonial experience. Governors symbolized imperial presence daily. Ceremonies reinforced authority and hierarchy. Flags, uniforms, rituals displayed power. Colonial subjects encountered empire through them. Appointment system reinforced centralized empire. Governors ensured Paris retained ultimate control. Local autonomy remained constrained. Administration served French imperial interests. France promoted assimilation in colonial policy. Goal was to make subjects culturally French. Language, law, education, and religion enforced. Colonies became extensions of French identity. Assimilation applied primarily in Africa and Asia. Colonial elites were encouraged to adopt French ways. Customs, dress, and social norms transformed slowly. Education served as main vehicle for change. Legal systems reflected metropolitan France. French laws replaced indigenous practices. Courts operated according to French codes. Justice symbolized civilizing mission of empire. Schools taught French language and culture. Children learned history, geography, and civics. Curriculum emphasized loyalty to France. Education reinforced political and cultural control. Missionaries supported assimilation efforts actively. Religion was intertwined with civilizing agenda. Christianity spread alongside French norms. Moral and cultural transformation combined. Urban centers became focal points of policy. Administrators concentrated on towns and ports. Rural populations often resisted influence. Assimilation reached limited segments effectively. French language became primary tool. Official documents, education, and governance used it. Indigenous languages discouraged in public life. Communication reinforced cultural dominance. Elite collaboration was essential for success. Local leaders adopted French dress, manners, etiquette. They mediated between population and state. Assimilation relied on cooperation strategically. Economic incentives encouraged compliance with culture. Jobs, education, and privileges favored assimilated subjects. Social mobility depended on adopting French ways. Policy rewarded cultural conformity consistently. Assimilation created hybrid identities over time. Colonial elites blended local and French elements. Urban culture reflected European influence clearly. Rural traditions persisted more strongly. Resistance persisted among general population. Cultural imposition faced subtle and overt defiance. Local practices continued privately. Colonial authorities adapted to realities. Policy reflected belief in French superiority. Civilizing mission justified governance methods. Empire aimed to reshape subject identity. Cultural transformation was goal and rationale. Assimilation policies varied by colony importance. Strategic locations received more attention. Peripheral areas remained largely autonomous. Pragmatism tempered ideological ambitions. Legal and educational reforms accompanied policy. Courts, schools, missions reinforced identity. Subjects experienced French culture systematically. Assimilation became practical tool of empire. Ultimately, assimilation was partially successful. Urban elites often embraced French norms. Wider populations retained traditional practices. Policy influence was limited but enduring. French language, law, and culture spread. Colonial society changed unevenly across regions. Assimilation shaped elite behavior and governance. Cultural legacy influenced post-colonial societies significantly. France later adopted policy of association. Recognition that assimilation faced practical limits. Colonial administration became more flexible. Local customs and authorities gained respect. Association acknowledged cultural diversity strategically. Governance accommodated indigenous law traditions. Traditional leaders retained some authority. French retained ultimate control always. Policy emerged in early 20th century. Experience showed full assimilation impractical. Rural populations resisted imposed culture. Flexibility ensured stability and cooperation. Administrators relied on indirect rule. Chiefs governed communities under supervision. Colonial councils advised on local matters. French oversaw, but did not micromanage. Education shifted focus under association. Schools emphasized practical skills knowledge. Cultural imposition was reduced slightly. Subjects retained native languages, traditions. Economic policy complemented governance strategy. Local markets and production were managed. Exploitation continued, but with negotiated compliance. Association balanced revenue with reduced conflict. Military presence maintained authority consistently. Force ensured order when needed. Revolt suppressed decisively, but selectively. Power remained central despite concessions. Association required negotiation skills from governors. Diplomacy replaced some coercive methods. French authority depended on cooperation. Alliances ensured smoother administration. Policy fostered limited political participation. Local councils allowed input on local issues. Colonial subjects experienced partial self-governance. Authority remained asymmetric in practice. Legal systems accommodated indigenous practices. Courts recognized customary laws. French courts handled major cases. Blended legal framework maintained stability. Cultural compromise replaced total assimilation. Public rituals reflected both traditions. Festivals, ceremonies merged European and local elements. Identity became hybridized gradually. Association acknowledged practical governance realities. Population size resource constraints influenced approach. French sought sustainable long-term control. Flexibility replaced rigid ideological enforcement. Economic exploitation continued under supervision. Taxation and labor obligations remained essential. Revenue still flowed to France. Colonial economy remained extraction-oriented. Policy aimed to reduce resistance. Collaboration encouraged compliance. Local leaders incentivized to cooperate. Stability ensured through negotiation and authority. Military, administration, economy, and culture intertwined. Association reflected pragmatic colonial strategy. French Empire adapted lessons from experience. Governance evolved with changing circumstances. Shift from assimilation to association marked more realistic colonial administration. Acknowledged limits of cultural imposition. Maintained imperial dominance with pragmatic flexibility. Colonial subjects retained greater autonomy. Authority became negotiated, not imposed. Hybrid governance balanced power and local norms. French control persisted effectively throughout empire. France maintained strong metropolitan control firmly. Colonies remained subordinate to central authority. Paris dictated policy and administration strictly. Local autonomy was limited consistently. Ministries in France oversaw all decisions. Colonial governors reported regularly to Paris. Orders flowed directly from the metropole. Distance did not reduce imperial oversight. Communication relied on ships and dispatches. Messages took months to reach colonies. Delays required governors to exercise judgment, yet ultimate authority rested in France. Revenue collection reinforced metropolitan dominance. Taxes and trade profits flowed back. Colonial economies were tightly regulated centrally. Economic control ensured France benefited maximally. Military forces backed administrative authority. Armies and navies enforced compliance constantly. Local resistance was swiftly suppressed. Power projection secured imperial interests. Laws were imposed from France uniformly. French legal codes replaced indigenous systems. Courts operated under metropolitan supervision. Justice reflected imperial priorities exclusively. Education systems promoted French ideology. Schools trained clerks and loyal elites. Curriculum emphasized loyalty to Paris. Cultural influence reinforced political obedience. Political appointments came directly from France. Governors and administrators owed loyalty exclusively. Merit, connections, and loyalty determined positions. Centralization prevented local corruption from growing. Economic planning prioritized metropolitan needs. Raw materials were exported systematically. Colonial labor served French industries. Profit motives dominated policy decisions. Infrastructure projects reflected imperial priorities. Roads, ports, and harbors facilitated trade. Investments served extraction, not local development. Colonies remained resource satellites efficiently. Strategic locations were closely monitored. Naval bases controlled trade and movement. France maintained military superiority consistently. Overseas territories were vital to national power. Information networks strengthened metropolitan oversight. Reports on economy, population, and security. Intelligence guided decision-making centrally. Control extended through bureaucratic systems. Cultural policies reinforced central authority. French language, law, and customs enforced. Assimilation policies reflected metropolitan ideals. Empire shaped colonies culturally and politically. Even indirect administration served France. Local rulers were supervised continuously. Autonomy was tolerated partially only. Paris dictated framework and limits. Strong metropolitan control ensured empire cohesion. Centralized governance maximized efficiency and compliance. French authority remained visible and pervasive. Colonial subjects experienced power from afar. France relied heavily on military force. Colonies were acquired through strategic campaigns. Weapons and discipline enforced imperial ambitions. Army enabled rapid territorial expansion overseas. Naval power supported distance operations effectively. Ships transported troops, supplies, and artillery. Sea control determined success in warfare. Overseas conquest depended on naval superiority. Soldiers established authority quickly in new territories. Military presence intimidated local populations significantly. Force-backed treaties and negotiations. Occupation reinforced political control immediately. Fortifications secured newly acquired lands strategically. Forts and garrisons protected supply routes. Defense structures deterred rival powers efficiently. Colonies were stabilized through military architecture. Military campaigns often preceded settlement expansion. Troops cleared areas for administrative infrastructure. Conquest facilitated economic exploitation afterward. Colonial towns arose around garrison centers. Local resistance faced organized, superior forces. Indigenous armies lacked comparable weaponry. Technology and training ensured French victories. Firepower shaped territorial outcomes decisively. Mercenaries and local auxiliaries were employed. France supplemented troops with allied contingents. Knowledge of terrain influenced tactical decisions. Combined forces enhanced operational effectiveness significantly. Logistics played critical role in military campaigns. Supply lines were carefully maintained and guarded. Transport of food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Sustainment ensured prolonged campaign success reliably. Military leaders were often experienced veterans. Strategic planning emphasized rapid decisive action. Maps, reconnaissance, and intelligence informed movements. Coordination reduced unnecessary losses dramatically. Occupation armies enforced administrative policies immediately. Soldiers guarded officials and key locations. Military justice backed colonial authority. Discipline reinforced the power structure efficiently. Conquest justified as civilizing mission publicly. French propaganda highlighted bravery and duty. Military victories symbolized national prestige. Empire expanded visibly through martial achievement. Conflict with rival European powers influenced operations. Territorial gains secured against Spanish, British, Dutch. Competition accelerated conquest strategies significantly. Expansion often overlapped with global rivalries. Resistance suppression relied on military superiority. Insurgencies were crushed quickly and decisively. Demonstrations of power discouraged future rebellions. French army maintained dominance throughout colonies. Military conquest laid foundations for administration. Troops enabled governance and law enforcement. Presence of force legitimized colonial authority. Security facilitated trade, settlement, and revenue. France launched key campaigns across North Africa. Territories included Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco strategically. Military operations combined conquest and occupation. Expansion aimed at political and economic control. Algeria became central target for French forces. Invasion began early 19th century decisively. Army faced resistance from local tribes. Persistence overcame harsh terrain and opposition. Fortified cities were primary objectives initially. Coastal ports ensured supply and reinforcements. Sieges involved artillery and disciplined infantry. Urban centers became administrative hubs later. Military leaders organized campaigns meticulously. Strategy balanced direct assault with negotiation. French forces exploited rivalries among local factions. Divide and conquer tactics proved effective. Resistance was fierce and prolonged continuously. Tribal alliances challenged French occupation frequently. Guerrilla warfare tested army endurance strategically. Adaptation and discipline ensured eventual dominance. Tunisia faced diplomatic and military pressure. Protectorate established after negotiations and threats. Limited force used to enforce French influence. Military presence reinforced political authority consistently. Morocco campaigns focused on strategic border regions. Treaties followed shows of military strength. Army demonstrated capacity without full-scale occupation. Demonstrations secured compliance from local rulers. Infrastructure facilitated control after conquest. Roads, forts, and garrisons reinforced authority. Military engineers supported both logistics and administration. Occupation relied on mobility and fortification. Naval support enabled troop movement efficiently. Mediterranean fleet projected power across coasts. Supply lines maintained dominance and operational capacity. Sea control complemented land campaigns effectively. Campaigns faced disease climates and terrain challenges. Soldiers endured harsh deserts, mountainous regions. Adaptation included local guides and knowledge. Experience refined French military strategies continually. Colonial administration followed military conquest promptly. Governors established law and taxation rapidly. Army remained ready to quell rebellion. Control was enforced through combined power. Campaigns boosted national prestige and influence. Success demonstrated France's ability to project power. Military achievements were celebrated domestically widely. Empire gained legitimacy through conquest and presence. Key campaigns created enduring French influence. North African territories became core imperial holdings. Military victory enabled economic and political exploitation. Control shaped regional dynamics for decades. Local populations suffered heavy disruption consistently. Resistance was quelled through superior arms decisively. Military occupation reshaped societies profoundly. Colonial administration relied on ongoing force. France pursued conquest aggressively in Indochina. Territories included Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia strategically. Military campaigns combined land and naval operations. Expansion aimed at economic resources and influence. Initial interventions focused on trade protection. French missionaries often preceded military presence. Incidents provided justification for armed intervention. Diplomacy backed by threat of force effectively. Tonkin and Cochin China became key targets. Army and Navy coordinated assaults simultaneously. Sieges captured strategic cities quickly. Occupation established administrative control efficiently. Campaigns faced challenging terrain and climate. Tropical diseases affected troops severely. Adaptation included local guides and knowledge. Experience refined strategy continuously during operations. Naval power ensured supply and mobility. Coastal control secured trade and communication. Fleet supported troop movements inland reliably. Dominance required both sea and land power. Resistance arose from local dynasties frequently. Vietnamese forces attempted guerrilla warfare. French employed superior weaponry systematically. Persistence overcame organized and sporadic opposition. Protectorates were established after initial victories. Treaties formalized French authority diplomatically. Monarchs retained nominal power under French supervision. Administration relied on both coercion and negotiation. Military engineers built forts and infrastructure. Roads and ports facilitated troop deployment. Garrisons secured territories and trade routes. Occupation depended on logistical efficiency heavily. Economic exploitation followed military conquest closely. Rice, rubber, and minerals fueled French industry. Plantations and mines operated under strict oversight. Profit reinforced colonial strategic objectives strongly. Missionaries accompanied military and administration efforts. Religion supported cultural influence alongside governance. Christianity expanded in urban and coastal regions. Cultural presence reinforced political domination gradually. Colonial army incorporated local auxiliaries effectively. Vietnamese recruits supplemented French forces. Training and organization ensured loyalty partially. Combined units strengthened overall military capability. French victory demonstrated technological and tactical superiority. Use of artillery and disciplined infantry decisive. Experience shaped future colonial campaigns globally. Indochina became model for military administrative approach. Colonial administration stabilized under French control. Governors implemented laws, taxation, and security. Military remained ready to suppress insurgencies. Empire relied on persistent armed presence. Indochina conquest enhanced national prestige internationally. Success justified further expansion in Asia. Military triumph facilitated political and economic gains. Colonial model influenced later imperial strategies. Colonial armies played central role consistently. They enforced control across vast territories. Military presence maintained order and authority. Force underpinned governance and administration effectively. Recruitment included both French and local soldiers. Indigenous troops supplemented metropolitan forces. Auxiliaries provided knowledge of terrain. Combined units enhanced operational flexibility significantly. Armies protected economic interests vigorously. Trade routes, plantations, and ports guarded. Revenue collection relied on armed enforcement. Security ensured uninterrupted resource extraction reliably. Training emphasized discipline, loyalty, and cohesion. French officers commanded strategically organized units. Indigenous soldiers learned European tactics. Military hierarchy maintained strict obedience consistently. Colonial armies suppressed revolts efficiently. Insurgencies met coordinated, decisive response. Show of force deterred potential rebellion. Rebellion management relied on superior organization. Engineering units built forts and infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and garrisons supported operations. Logistics depended on army planning, Occupation relied on fortified positions strategically. Armies conducted reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Scouting informed strategy and tactical movements. Knowledge of local terrain ensured success. Military intelligence guided colonial decisions continuously. Naval forces complemented colonial armies. Ships transported troops and supplies effectively. Coastline control supported inland campaigns. Sea power reinforced territorial dominance substantially. Colonial soldiers sometimes engaged in policing duties, maintained public order and enforced regulations. Civil and military roles often overlapped. Military presence symbolized state authority continuously. Campaigns across Africa, Asia, and Caribbean demonstrated versatility and strategic adaptation. Experience shaped future recruitment and deployment. Colonial army became backbone of expansion. Service in colonial armies affected social mobility. Opportunities for advancement existed for loyal locals. French officers monitored performance carefully. Career progression reinforced loyalty to empire. Armies also trained local militias occasionally. Supplementary forces strengthened territorial control. Military organization projected authority broadly. Force reinforced both economic and political aims. Morale and discipline were maintained strictly. Punishments deterred insubordination effectively. Rewards encouraged loyalty and efficiency consistently. Order underpinned successful administration and conquest. Colonial armies ensured France retained influence. Military dominance supported administration and trade. Force was central to imperial strategy. Colonial security relied on sustained army presence. France used force to suppress resistance movements. Colonial subjects often resisted occupation actively. Rebellions threatened economic and political control. Suppression relied on coordinated military campaigns. Indigenous uprisings were met with discipline. Superior weaponry ensured French advantage consistently. Guerrilla tactics were countered strategically. Persistence overcame fragmented opposition effectively. Punitive expeditions targeted rebellious regions directly. Villages, towns, and fortifications were assaulted. Rebels were captured, imprisoned, or executed. Demonstrations of power discouraged future uprisings. Intelligence networks tracked insurgent activities carefully. Local informants provided crucial information. Knowledge of terrain aided military response. Surveillance strengthened overall colonial control significantly. Resistance movements varied across territories frequently. North Africa, Indochina, and Caribbean experienced unrest. Causes included taxation, cultural imposition, and exploitation. French suppression adapted to local conditions strategically. Colonial armies conducted rapid deployment offensives. Mobile units responded quickly to disturbances. Fortifications provided secure bases of operation. Army maintained readiness to intervene immediately. Psychological tactics reinforced military suppression effectively. Public executions and displays of force intimidated populations. Demonstrations served as warnings to potential rebels. Authority was asserted visibly and decisively. Negotiation accompanied force in some cases. French sometimes co-opted local leaders selectively. Alliances weakened resistance potential strategically. Combined coercion and diplomacy ensured compliance. Infrastructure development facilitated control over rebellious areas. Roads, forts, and garrisons allowed troop mobility. Supply lines ensured rapid response capability. Occupation integrated military and administrative functions. Repression extended to cultural and social domains. Religious practices were regulated, leaders monitored. Education and propaganda reinforced colonial authority. Subtle control complemented direct military action. Economic consequences punished insurgents systematically. Fines, confiscation, and forced labor implemented. Rebellion proved costly for participants economically. Material deterrence reinforced military measures. French success relied on organization and coordination. Campaigns were planned meticulously with clear objectives. Hierarchical command ensured discipline and effectiveness. Centralized strategy dictated local tactical implementation. Suppression campaigns influenced colonial policies subsequently. Harsh lessons prompted administrative adjustments. Resistance shaped future military and governance approaches. Experience reinforced the need for persistent authority. Colonial dominance depended on swift, decisive action. Delays could embolden further opposition. Force remained central to maintaining control. Stability relied on military and administrative synergy. French colonies supplied essential raw materials. Resources fueled industry and metropolitan wealth. Extraction drove imperial economic strategy firmly. Colonies existed primarily for resource provision. Minerals included gold, silver, and copper. France exploited mining operations extensively. Colonial mountains and rivers were surveyed. Extraction methods often relied on forced labor, timber, rubber, and other forest products. Forests were logged for construction and trade. Naval supplies, furniture, and export markets. Natural resources linked directly to France. Coal and iron deposits fueled industry. Mining regions became strategically important. Local populations worked under harsh conditions. Colonial administrators prioritized production above welfare. Agricultural raw materials supplemented industrial demand. Cotton, sugar, and coffee exported regularly. Plantations harvested resources for European consumption. Economic planning focused on efficiency maximization. Resource extraction relied on complex supply chains. Ports, roads, and rivers facilitated transport. Ships carried commodities across oceans efficiently. Infrastructure underpinned imperial economic control. Technology and labor combined to increase yield. European tools improved productivity and output. Mechanization remained limited, but effective locally. Work organization mirrored metropolitan industry practices. Colonial oversight ensured steady production levels. Governors and administrators monitored resource flow. Reports detailed output, shortages, and efficiency. Accountability reinforced central economic control. Extraction often conflicted with local ecological stability. Deforestation, soil depletion, and water use. Environmental impact was largely ignored. Economic gain took precedence over sustainability. Trade agreements ensured monopoly on raw materials. Colonies sold primarily to metropolitan markets. Rival European powers were excluded strategically. Mercantilist policies reinforced French economic dominance. Revenue from extraction financed French ambitions. Military, administration, and further colonization supported. Profits justified continued imperial expansion. Economic dependence tied colonies firmly to France. Raw material extraction shaped colonial society. Labor was regimented to maintain productivity. Social hierarchy reinforced control over workers. Communities adapted to production demands. Resistance to extraction occurred sporadically. Local populations sometimes sabotaged or fled. French forces suppressed opposition decisively. Imperial objectives maintained at human cost. Extraction laid foundations for broader economic networks. Raw materials linked to trade, labor, and industry. Colonial prosperity benefited metropolitan institutions directly. France profited extensively from resource control. Plantation economies dominated French colonial production. Larger states focused on cash crops, sugar, coffee, and tobacco were prioritized. Colonies became centers of agricultural exports. Plantations relied on monoculture cultivation systems. Soil depletion required constant land expansion. Crop rotation was minimal or ignored. Profit maximization drove agricultural decisions strictly. Enslaved labor formed plantation workforce primarily. Africans provided the bulk of labor. Harsh conditions enforced strict discipline. Mortality rates were high consistently. European planters controlled economic and social life. They managed production, trade, and security. Planters wielded authority over local populations. Wealth and power concentrated among elite. Plantation economies integrated with metropolitan markets. Goods exported to France regularly. Colonial production tied directly to European demand. Commerce depended on efficient agricultural output. Irrigation and tools improved productivity slightly. Techniques were adapted from Europe and locally. Innovation focused on maximizing yield efficiently. Methods prioritized profit over environmental sustainability. Plantation towns and ports developed nearby. Infrastructure supported trade and labor management. Roads and warehouses facilitated commodity transport. Economic planning centered on production efficiency. Resistance among enslaved populations was persistent. Revolts, escape, and sabotage were common. Military and overseers maintained strict control. Authority relied on constant vigilance and force. Colonial policies favored large estates exclusively. Smallholders or indigenous agriculture was marginalized. Economic hierarchy mirrored European social structures. Elite planters reinforced metropolitan dominance locally. Seasonal labor demands structured daily life. Planting, harvesting, and processing followed strict schedules. Work intensity varied with crop cycles. Discipline ensured predictable economic output consistently. Profits financed further imperial ventures. Revenue contributed to state, army, and navy. Plantations became critical to colonial economic strategy. Colonial success measured in export earnings. Trade networks centered on plantation production. Commodities shipped to France efficiently. Merchants and administrators coordinated shipments. Colonial economy operated as extension of metropole. Plantation economies shaped cultural and social life. European customs dominated elite populations. Enslaved communities preserved cultural identity privately. Hybrid cultures emerged under constrained circumstances. Environmental impact was significant and lasting. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, and monoculture persisted. Ecological change accompanied economic exploitation. Colonial landscapes were permanently transformed. Plantation economies became foundation of imperial wealth. Agricultural production reinforced metropolitan economic power. Colonies served as engines of French prosperity. Profit drove policy and colonial expansion decisively. Trade networks connected colonies directly to France. Goods, resources, and commodities flowed continuously. Shipping routes linked ports across oceans. Empire depended on efficient maritime commerce. Colonial exports included sugar, coffee, and cotton. Raw materials fueled metropolitan industry consistently. Imports supplied settlers and administrators locally. Trade sustained both economy and colonial society. Merchant companies managed routes and logistics. French East India Company played key role. Ships carried goods between multiple colonies. Coordination ensured supply chains remained reliable. Triangular trade linked Europe, Africa, colonies strategically. Slaves, raw materials, and manufactured goods exchanged. Network integrated imperial territories economically. France benefited from monopoly and control. Ports served as hubs for trade activity. Warehouses stored commodities before shipment. Customs and tariffs regulated commerce effectively. Revenue reinforced metropolitan control over colonies. Naval protection safeguarded shipping lanes. Convoys prevented piracy and rival interference. French fleet projected power globally. Maritime dominance ensured uninterrupted economic flow. Colonial towns developed around trade centers. Urban infrastructure supported market and storage. Merchants, officials, and planters coordinated activities. Economic life centered on export and import. Local economies adapted to global demand. Production prioritized European market requirements. Subsistence agriculture often secondary to exports. Economic planning served metropolitan interests primarily. Administrative oversight regulated trade policies rigorously. Governors and councils monitored commodities carefully. Licenses and monopolies enforced by states. Colonial trade operated under strict supervision. Trade influenced social hierarchies and labor allocation. Elite merchants gained wealth and prestige. Common laborers supplied workforce. Social structure reinforced by economic activity. Communication networks supported coordination across territories. Reports on shipments and production informed decisions. Merchants adapted routes according to demand. Efficiency maintained profitability consistently. European rivalries threatened colonial trade routes. Naval conflicts disrupted shipment temporarily. Military and diplomacy secured uninterrupted commerce. Competition drove strategic expansion of routes. Trade networks encouraged economic specialization regionally. Caribbean focused on sugar. Indochina on rice. Africa supplied minerals and raw materials. Colonies integrated into a coordinated global system. Colonial trade strengthened metropolitan economy decisively. Revenue financed administration, military, and infrastructure. France relied on colonies for sustained wealth. Empire operated as interconnected economic network efficiently. Colonial economies depended on exploitation of labor. Enslaved Africans provided majority of workforce. Indigenous populations were often coerced systematically. Labor-fueled plantations, mines, and infrastructure projects. Forced labor was strictly enforced daily. Oversight maintained by military and administrators. Punishments ensured compliance consistently. Rebellions were suppressed decisively and quickly. Plantation workers endured long hours, harsh conditions. Mortality rates remained high consistently. Survival depended on resilience and adaptation. Colonial authorities prioritized productivity above welfare. Indentured servants supplemented enslaved labor force. European settlers occasionally provided additional work. Labor contracts favored metropolitan interests exclusively. Workers had minimal rights or protections. Colonial administration monitored labor efficiency closely. Registers tracked assignments, output, and attendance. Performance influenced rewards or disciplinary action. State enforced legal framework for exploitation. Mining operations relied on organized labor systems. Extraction of minerals required coordinated workforce. Safety and health were secondary concerns. Economic output took precedence over human life. Labor exploitation extended to urban and rural sectors. Roads, ports, and fortifications constructed forcibly. Men, women, and sometimes children compelled to work. Communities were structured around labor demands strictly. Resistance and sabotage occurred frequently. Workers sought escape, slowed productivity, or revolted. Military force and punitive measures maintained control. Opposition was suppressed using superior firepower. Economic incentives occasionally encouraged voluntary participation. Skilled laborers sometimes received higher pay. Opportunities were rare and controlled tightly. Benefit remained limited compared to exploitation level. Missionaries and administrators also regulated labor morally. Conversion and education intertwined with workforce management. Cultural control reinforced labor discipline. Social structures adapted to colonial needs. Labor systems reinforced social hierarchies effectively. Elites benefited from exploitation extensively. Peasants and slaves remained under strict authority. Metropolitan profit was maximized consistently. Economic exploitation fueled broader imperial objectives. Revenue financed administration, trade, and military expansion. Colonial productivity ensured metropolitan prosperity. Labor remained backbone of imperial economic strategy. Colonial wealth provided immense benefits to France. Revenue funded administration, military, and navy. Trade profits strengthened metropolitan economy. Colonies contributed directly to national prosperity. Raw materials fueled industrial production domestically. Sugar, cotton, and coffee sustained manufacturing. Resources supplied European markets consistently. Economic growth relied on colonial output. Plantation and mining profits enriched elite classes. Merchants, administrators, and investors gained wealth. Colonial enterprises generated personal and state revenue. Elite influence expanded through economic dominance. Taxation returned funds to metropolitan coffers. Customs duties and tariffs added substantially. Colonial fiscal policies prioritized French benefit. Revenue reinforced central authority over colonies. Trade networks enhanced economic integration globally. Goods transported efficiently between colonies and France. Shipbuilding, ports, and merchants profited directly. Maritime commerce became foundation of imperial wealth. Military campaigns were financed through colonial profits. Expansion and defense relied on extracted resources. Armies and navies supported imperial ambitions. Colonial revenue underpinned France's global influence. Economic dependency strengthened control over colonies. Metropole dictated production and trade priorities. Colonies served strategic interests consistently. Wealth flowed predominantly toward France. Industrial investment expanded from colonial revenue. Factories processed raw materials domestically. Employment increased in metropolitan centers significantly. Colonial goods boosted French economy comprehensively. Luxury consumption in France rose steadily. Sugar, coffee, and exotic goods proliferated. Colonial imports symbolized status and influence. European society benefited materially and culturally. Economic policies reinforced social hierarchies locally. Merchants, investors, and bureaucrats accumulated wealth. Colonial labor provided cheap production inputs. Metropole capitalized on minimal local investment. Colonial exploitation financed infrastructure development. Roads, ports, and fortifications built strategically. Projects strengthened both economy and military. Imperial control maintained through economic power. Profits encouraged further expansion overseas. Revenue justified continued military campaigns. Colonial administration was sustained effectively. Economic success reinforced imperial policy. French dominance benefited from systemic extraction. Colonies ensured reliable flow of wealth. Metropolitan economy thrived on overseas exploitation. Colonial system proved highly profitable consistently. Colonial income supported political and cultural ambitions. Funding backed exploration, education, and propaganda. Empire projected power economically, militarily, culturally. Metropole strength relied on colonial contribution. Colonial economic benefits shaped French society. Wealth accumulation reinforced national identity. Imperial prosperity linked directly to colonies. France flourished due to global resource control. French language spread throughout colonial territories. Official documents, schools, and administration used it. Metropolitan culture was promoted systematically. Colonies became extensions of French identity. Urban centers experienced strongest linguistic influence. Port towns, capitals, and administrative hubs. Local elites adopted French for prestige. Language became tool for social mobility. French literature, art, and customs circulated. Theaters, publications, and music reinforced culture. Elite society emulated metropolitan trends consistently. Cultural symbols reflected power and sophistication. Public ceremonies showcased French traditions prominently. Festivals, parades, and official rituals observed. Authority was reinforced through cultural performance. Colonial subjects experienced power visually and socially. Everyday life adopted French norms gradually. Dress, etiquette, and manners influenced local populations. Urban households imitated metropolitan styles deliberately. Lifestyle reflected assimilationist pressures continually. Language facilitated administration and legal systems. Courts and officials conducted proceedings in French. Colonial governance relied on shared communication. Understanding reinforced loyalty to metropolitan authority. Trade, education, and religion reinforced culture. Schools taught French language systematically. Church services were conducted in French. Cultural transmission accompanied institutional functions. Elite collaboration accelerated cultural adoption locally. Local leaders adopted language and customs selectively. Social recognition depended on assimilation. Authority and status intertwined with culture. Rural areas experienced slower cultural penetration. Traditional practices persisted in villages. French influence reached through intermediaries occasionally. Assimilation was uneven geographically consistently. Cultural festivals integrated French and local elements. Hybrid identities emerged under colonial conditions. Metropolitan culture adapted partially to local realities. Colonial societies became culturally layered gradually. Media and publications promoted metropolitan ideals. Newspapers, books, and pamphlets circulated widely. Ideas of civilization and progress were emphasized. French identity was idealized in colonial consciousness. Language became primary instrument of control. Communication centralized administration effectively. French literacy determined access to opportunities. Colonial authority relied on linguistic dominance. Economic interactions reinforced cultural norms regularly. Merchants and administrators modeled French behavior. Urban markets reflected metropolitan customs. Consumer culture transmitted French influence consistently. Cultural spread shaped identity across generations. Children learned language and traditions in school. Elite families adopted French manners at home. Colonial society gradually reflected metropolitan values. French language and culture left lasting impact. Colonial administration, education, and trade intertwined. Identity formation was shaped by metropolitan influence. Legacy persisted beyond formal colonial period. Christian missionaries accompanied French colonial expansion. Their work combined religion, education, and influence. Missionaries aimed to convert local populations. Religion became tool for cultural and political control. Jesuits, Capuchins, and other orders active. They traveled to towns, villages, and rural areas. Mission stations often served as administrative centers. Church authority reinforced French colonial presence. Conversions were encouraged through education systematically. Schools taught literacy alongside religious instruction. Children learned prayers, catechism, and European customs. Faith became vehicle for cultural assimilation. Missionaries sometimes mediated between locals and administrators. They influenced diplomacy, trade, and law. Church acted as intermediary in governance. Religion reinforced imperial authority subtly. Health and charity accompanied missionary efforts. Hospitals and clinics served both aid and control. Providing services strengthened acceptance of French presence. Missionaries gained trust while spreading European ideals. Resistance to conversion persisted occasionally. Local beliefs and practices remained strong. Missionaries faced threats and hostility regularly. Persistence gradually expanded Christian influence successfully. Missionary activity reinforced metropolitan ideology systematically. Moral instruction accompanied cultural indoctrination. Religious festivals aligned with French customs. Christianity became intertwined with public life. Education reinforced missionary objectives effectively. School attendance increased literacy and doctrinal adherence. Missionaries taught European languages, arts, and sciences. Faith shaped worldview of younger generations. Conversion often targeted elite families strategically. Adoption of Christianity provided access to privileges. Social mobility linked to religious compliance. Christianity became marker of status and loyalty. Missionaries documented local customs and languages. They produced ethnographic and linguistic records. Knowledge supported administration and cultural policy. Church served both spiritual and practical purposes. Religion shaped social hierarchy in colonies. Missionaries influenced moral, cultural, and legal norms. Christianity validated metropolitan authority symbolically. Faith intertwined with governance consistently. Military and administrative authorities supported missions. Missionaries received protection for safety and influence. Collaboration ensured spread of religion and control. Church and state reinforced each other strategically. Mission civilisatrice was embedded in missionary work. Conversion justified colonial intervention morally. Spreading civilization combined spiritual and political goals. Missionaries acted as cultural intermediaries and educators. Christian missionary activity left enduring legacy. Religion influenced education, governance, and social life. Colonial societies integrated aspects of European Christianity. Cultural transformation persisted across generations subtly. French education systems spread widely across colonies. Schools taught language, literacy, and European culture. Education reinforced colonial administration and authority. Children became conduits of metropolitan influence. Primary schools introduced basic reading, writing, arithmetic. Curriculum included French history, geography, and civics. Moral instruction aligned with colonial and religious ideals. Education fostered loyalty to France systematically. Secondary institutions trained future administrators and elites. Curriculum prepared students for bureaucratic service. Graduates often joined colonial civil administration. Schools created intermediaries between colony and metropole. Missionaries often managed educational institutions locally. Church and state collaborated in schooling efforts. Religious instruction accompanied general literacy education. Faith reinforced metropolitan values and social norms. French language was central in all education. Instruction conducted primarily in metropolitan French. Local languages were discouraged in official settings. Language served as vehicle for cultural assimilation. Girls' education was limited, but gradually expanding. Focus was on domestic skills and literacy. Elite families prioritized French-style education selectively. Gender norms shaped educational opportunities significantly. Technical and vocational schools addressed economic needs. Training prepared students for commerce and industry. Education supported resource extraction and administrative efficiency. Practical skills reinforced imperial objectives consistently. Schools became hubs of cultural transformation. European customs, dress, and etiquette taught explicitly. Children learned metropolitan behaviors and societal expectations. Education aligned with broader civilizing mission objectives. Colonial governments established inspection and oversight systems. Teachers were trained and monitored centrally. Curricula were standardized to maintain uniformity. Policy ensured consistent metropolitan influence locally. Education extended metropolitan social hierarchy into colonies. Elite children accessed higher quality schools. Opportunities reinforced loyalty and compliance with France. Social mobility was tied to schooling success. Boarding schools facilitated control over remote populations. Students lived under supervision of instructors. Daily routines reinforced discipline and cultural norms. Colonial authority shaped behavior through structured education. Resistance or skepticism toward education occurred occasionally. Some families prioritized traditional or local learning. Adaptation was required to encourage attendance. Authorities used incentives and social pressure effectively. Education also promoted civic and moral values. Citizenship ideals aligned with French political philosophy. Subjects learned obedience, respect for authority consistently. Schools molded colonial identities gradually. Literacy and education linked to administrative participation. Bureaucratic systems relied on trained clerks. Education created a bridge between France and colonies. Knowledge facilitated both governance and cultural assimilation. French education systems left enduring colonial legacy. Language, culture, and bureaucratic skills persisted. Institutions shaped elite identities and governance practices. Schools reinforced imperial ideology across generations. French colonial authorities implemented cultural assimilation policies. Goal was to transform subjects into French citizens. Language, laws, and customs were imposed strictly. Colonies became extensions of metropolitan culture directly. Policies targeted elites and urban populations primarily. Education and administration reinforced assimilation efforts. Local leaders were encouraged to adopt French norms. Compliance brought social and political advantages consistently. Legal systems replaced indigenous customs gradually. Courts operated under metropolitan codes. French law standardized governance and dispute resolution. Authority was centralized and culturally prescriptive. Religion supported assimilation through moral instruction. Christianity taught alongside civic and social norms. Missionaries reinforced metropolitan ideals systematically. Faith became instrument of cultural transformation. Language served as primary tool of assimilation. French became mandatory in schools, courts, administration. Local languages were discouraged in official contexts. Linguistic conformity reinforced loyalty and identity. Education promoted European customs and values consistently. Curriculum included history, geography, and civic duties. Children learned metropolitan etiquette, behavior, and traditions. Schooling aligned with broader civilizing mission objectives. Urban elites were main targets of policies. Adoption of French dress, manners, and social norms. Status was linked to assimilation compliance. Metropolitan culture became aspirational and influential. Economic incentives supported assimilation strategies deliberately. Jobs, positions, and privileges favored compliant subjects. Participation in colonial governance depended on cultural adaptation. Practical benefits encouraged gradual adoption of French ways. Public rituals and ceremonies reflected French culture. Festivals, parades, and civic events reinforced identity. Colonial authority was visible through cultural demonstration. Communities experienced power symbolically and socially. Resistance persisted in rural and remote areas. Traditional customs, languages, and practices endured privately. Assimilation was uneven geographically consistently. Pragmatism tempered strict ideological enforcement. Administration monitored adoption of policies closely. Reports, inspections, and evaluations ensured compliance. Governors adjusted strategies based on local conditions. Authority remained flexible but centralized. Assimilation policies shaped social hierarchies significantly. Elites became intermediaries between colonizers and locals. Status depended on acceptance of metropolitan norms. Loyalty and cultural conformity were rewarded. Cultural assimilation reinforced broader imperial objectives. Identity, loyalty, and governance intertwined strategically. Colonial subjects gradually adopted metropolitan values selectively. Policies left enduring cultural and institutional legacy. French colonial rule profoundly impacted indigenous societies. Traditional structures, authority, and customs were disrupted. Communities experienced social, political, and cultural transformation. Colonial administration reshaped daily life extensively. Local governance was often replaced or subordinated. Chiefs, councils, and leaders lost autonomy. French authorities imposed metropolitan administrative systems. Power shifted toward colonial officials consistently. Economic life was restructured under imperial priorities. Subsistence farming declined in favor of exports. Labor was redirected to plantations, mines, infrastructure. Communities became integrated into colonial economy gradually. Social hierarchies were altered significantly. Elites who cooperated gained status and privilege. Commoners faced coercion, taxation, and labor obligations. Colonial authority reshaped relationships within communities. Religion transformed spiritual and cultural practices locally. Christianity replaced or modified indigenous belief systems. Missionaries influenced moral codes, rituals, and festivals. Faith became instrument of both control and education. Language imposition affected communication and identity. French became official language in administration and schools. Local languages declined in public and formal contexts. Linguistic assimilation influenced cultural self-perception consistently. Education reshaped childhood and knowledge transmission. Children learned metropolitan history, customs, and values. Traditional skills and knowledge were emphasized gradually. Colonial schooling created new socialized generations. Cultural practices adapted under colonial pressure. Festivals, arts, and ceremonies were modified. Hybrid cultural forms emerged combining French and local elements. Identity evolved amidst imposed norms and traditions. Resistance persisted despite cultural transformation. Communities maintained customs privately and clandestinely. Revolts, protests, and passive non-compliance occurred. French suppression ensured persistence of colonial order. Health and demographic patterns were affected severely. Diseases, labor demands, and warfare caused population decline. Traditional family and community structures were disrupted. Colonial policies reshaped settlement and migration patterns. Economic dependence limited local autonomy. Subsistence systems gave way to export-oriented production. Communities became reliant on metropolitan markets. Indigenous agency was constrained by imperial demands. Social cohesion was challenged by imposed hierarchies. Elite collaboration created new power divisions. Traditional authority was undermined systematically. Colonial society enforced metropolitan-defined status structures. Colonial impact extended across multiple generations. Cultural, social, and economic changes persisted long-term. Identity formation was influenced by imposed institutions. Indigenous societies adapted, resisted, and hybridized simultaneously. French colonial policies left enduring legacies. Language, religion, and governance persisted post-independence. Colonial structures shaped modern social and political life. Indigenous societies continue to reflect historical transformation. French colonies played a significant role in World War I. They provided manpower, resources, and strategic support. Colonial subjects were mobilized for war efforts. Empire contributed globally to French military campaigns. Troops were recruited from Africa, Indochina, Caribbean. Soldiers fought in Europe, Middle East, and colonies. Colonial regiments faced harsh combat conditions consistently. Their participation was essential for metropolitan defense. Labor and resources supported war infrastructure heavily. Rubber, metals, and food were exported systematically. Colonies supplied materials for munitions and equipment. Economic contributions sustained prolonged military operations. Local populations experienced social disruption severely. Men conscripted, communities left with labor shortages. Agriculture and production were redirected for wartime needs. Colonial life was reshaped by imperial demands. Colonial soldiers often served in front lines directly. Fought in trenches, artillery units, and cavalry. Experience exposed troops to modern warfare extensively. Casualty rates were high across all colonies. Medical care and logistics were organized carefully. Hospitals and field units treated wounded soldiers. Colonial troops adapted to European conditions. Experience influenced later military planning and strategy. Colonial elites promoted recruitment actively. Loyalty to France emphasized through incentives. Status, rewards, and recognition encouraged participation. Collaboration reinforced ties between metropole and colonies. Propaganda framed colonial involvement as duty. Mission civilisatrice justified participation morally. Empire-wide loyalty was emphasized publicly. Colonial contributions symbolized French global strength. Women and families supported war indirectly. Produced supplies, maintained households, and aided logistics. Civilian involvement reinforced overall wartime economy. Colonial societies experienced total war participation. Military leadership relied on colonial manpower strategically. Command integrated regiments from multiple territories. Coordination ensured efficiency across diverse units. Colonial troops became essential backbone of French army. Post-war recognition was partial and inconsistent. Medals, titles, and acknowledgement often limited. Sacrifices were undervalued compared to European soldiers. Tensions began to grow over colonial treatment. Colonial participation influenced social and political awareness. Exposure to European society shaped perspectives. Ideas of equality, rights, and nationalism spread. Colonial subjects began questioning imperial hierarchy. World War I strengthened France's global position. Colonial contributions ensured metropolitan survival effectively. Empire demonstrated interconnectedness and strategic significance. Colonies gained recognition, albeit limited and constrained. Colonial troops provided crucial manpower for France. Soldiers came from Africa, Indochina, Caribbean territories. Regiments reinforced depleted metropolitan forces consistently. Their contribution strengthened French military capacity significantly. Resources from colonies supported war effort extensively. Rubber, metals, and food supplied factories and armies. Agricultural and mineral outputs were redirected for combat. Economic support sustained prolonged European campaigns efficiently. African tirailleurs served in front lines bravely. Faced trenches, artillery, and harsh weather conditions. Units were organized under French command. Discipline and training ensured operational effectiveness consistently. Indo-Chinese and Pacific soldiers supplemented manpower. They served in Europe, Middle East, and colonies. Colonial contributions were geographically widespread. Empire demonstrated global strategic reach effectively. Naval and logistical support relied on colonies. Ports, ships, and supplies ensured continuous movement. Maritime infrastructure facilitated troop and resource deployment. Colonial networks enhanced operational efficiency significantly. Labor forces assisted behind front lines systematically. Constructed roads, bridges, and fortifications. Maintained supply lines and communication networks. Support roles enabled combat unit success. Medical services included colonial personnel actively. Nurses, orderlies, and stretcher bearers aided wounded. Hospitals in Europe and colonies coordinated care. Colonial contribution extended beyond combat consistently. Economic exploitation increased to sustain war demands. Crops and raw materials prioritized metropolitan needs. Plantations, mines, and production intensified. Colonial economies operated under strict wartime control. Recruitment and conscription varied by territory. Elite cooperation encouraged voluntary enlistment. Forced conscription used where manpower insufficient. Tensions grew due to heavy demands on colonies. Recognition of service was inconsistent and limited. Some troops received medals and titles. European soldiers were prioritized in honors. Colonial soldiers' sacrifices often undervalued systematically. Colonial contribution reinforced France's global reach. Empire proved indispensable in prolonged conflict. Experience strengthened metropolitan control over colonies. War highlighted interdependence of colonies and France. Participation influenced post-war colonial consciousness. Exposure to European society inspired political awareness. Ideas of rights, equality, and nationalism emerged. Seeds of decolonization were planted subtly. Colonial troops and resources ensured French victory. Empire's human and material support proved decisive. Metropole benefited militarily and economically immensely. Colonial involvement reshaped imperial relations permanently. World War II divided French colonial allegiance. Colonies faced choice between Vichy and Free France. Political loyalty influenced administration and military command. Empire became strategic battleground for control. Vichy regime controlled many overseas territories initially. Governors and officials followed metropolitan directives. Collaboration included administration, police, and economy. Authority reflected loyalty to occupied France. Free France gained support gradually overseas. Charles de Gaulle appealed to colonial leaders. Military and symbolic authority encouraged allegiance. Resistance movements strengthened Free French presence. Colonial troops joined Free French forces actively. Units fought in Africa, Middle East, Europe. Participation reinforced legitimacy of Free France. Colonial manpower was vital strategically. Economic resources supported war efforts under Free France. Ports, shipping, and raw materials supplied allies. Colonies provided logistical and industrial support. Empire contributed significantly to global operations. Propaganda influenced colonial public opinion strongly. Radio, newspapers, and emissaries promoted Free France. Vichy messages competed for loyalty and compliance. Ideological struggle extended across colonial societies. Local elites played crucial role in allegiance. Some cooperated with Vichy administration consistently. Others joined Free France for political advantage. Decisions influenced social, economic, and military factors. Resistance networks operated clandestinely in many colonies. Underground movements organized intelligence and sabotage. Support for Free France relied on covert activity. Colonial subjects risked punishment for defiance. Military campaigns reinforced political alignment decisively. Allied operations in North Africa shifted control. Liberation facilitated expansion of Free French authority. Battle outcomes directly affected colonial administration. Colonial surveillance experience divided loyalties socially. Families, communities, and elites were often split. Tension arose between collaboration and resistance. Daily life reflected complex political landscape. Strategic importance of colonies increased during war. Airfields, ports, and resources were critical. Empire ensured metropolitan survival and military capability. Global stakes influenced colonial decision-making significantly. Vichy policies included repression and economic control. Exploitation of resources continued under collaboration. Colonial administration faced dual pressures. Governance adapted to changing political realities. Post-war, allegiance shaped future political developments. Support for Free France enhanced legitimacy of leadership. Colonial participation reinforced ties and expectations. Political awareness among subjects increased notably. World War II highlighted empire's strategic importance. Colonies were both resource bases and battlegrounds. Loyalty, military, and economic contributions proved decisive. Experience influenced post-war colonial relations significantly. World War II strengthened colonial nationalism significantly. Exposure to European conflicts inspired political awareness. Colonial subjects questioned imperial authority increasingly. Desire for rights, equality, and independence grew. Troops returning from war brought new ideas. Experience in Europe shaped expectations and identity. Military service exposed subjects to political discourse. Colonial veterans became leaders in nationalist movements. Urban populations organized politically and socially. Labor unions, student groups, and associations emerged. Discussion of self-determination became widespread. Ideas of sovereignty challenged metropolitan control. Education and literacy promoted political consciousness. Schools and wartime experiences influenced young leaders. Awareness of global struggles fostered ambition. Colonial elites adopted nationalist ideologies actively. Newspapers, radio, and communication networks spread messages. Information from Europe and other colonies circulated. Ideas of freedom and independence gained traction. Media reinforced collective political identity consistently. Post-war economic hardship fueled discontent. Resource extraction and taxation continued despite contributions. Expectations of reward for wartime service unmet. Economic grievances strengthened nationalist resolve widely. Political organizations formed to negotiate rights. Movements demanded representation, reforms, and autonomy. Urban and rural areas participated selectively. Leadership often emerged from educated, experienced elites. Resistance networks from wartime continued activism. Former Free French supporters joined nationalist causes. Experience with clandestine operations strengthened organization. Strategic planning and coordination improved political campaigns. Indigenous cultural pride resurfaced alongside nationalism. Revival of traditions reinforced identity and cohesion. Colonial subjects sought recognition of heritage. Culture and politics became intertwined strategically. Metropolitan responses often ignored nationalist aspirations. Repression, censorship, and arrests fueled further discontent. Heavy-handed measures validated arguments for autonomy. Resistance became more organized and determined. International context influenced colonial nationalism strongly. United Nations and global decolonization movements inspired activism. Independence elsewhere provided models for local efforts. Colonial subjects looked outward for strategies and support. Colonial nationalism challenged legitimacy of French rule. Political consciousness became widespread across territories. Movements laid groundwork for post-war independence. War experience accelerated push for self-governance. Nationalist leaders emerged from veterans and educated classes. They combined military, political, and social influence. Leadership structured movements for broader mobilization. Colonial subjects increasingly demanded voice and power. World War II marked turning point decisively. Colonial identity became linked to national aspirations. Empire faced growing internal pressure consistently. Nationalism reshaped post-war political landscape permanently. Post-war period brought major political changes. Colonies demanded greater autonomy and self-governance. French Empire faced pressure to reform administration. Metropole had to negotiate new political frameworks. Constitutional reforms introduced limited representation locally. Colonial assemblies gained advisory or legislative roles. Governors remained powerful but faced consultation requirements. Participation increased political awareness among indigenous populations. Decolonization movements accelerated after wartime experiences. Nationalist parties organized to demand independence systematically. Leaders emerged from educated elites and veterans. Urban and rural populations became politically active. France established Union Francaise in 1946. Colonies were incorporated into French Union officially. Political structures aimed to maintain imperial ties. Autonomy was partial, still under metropolitan control. Elections and political parties proliferated in colonies. Colonial subjects could vote in local councils. Representation remained limited in metropolitan decision-making. Political engagement created platform for nationalist demands. Labor and social movements influenced post-war policies. Strikes, protests, and unions challenged colonial authority. Economic grievances became political leverage. Metropole attempted reforms to stabilize administration. International context supported colonial aspirations. United Nations and global opinion pressured France. Decolonization worldwide created momentum for change. French Empire had to adapt strategically. Constitutional adjustments aimed to prevent unrest. Colonial law codified rights and obligations. Governance balanced metropolitan interests with local demands. Policy emphasized gradual transition to self-rule. Economic reconstruction influenced political decision-making. Colonial resources were still exploited for metropolitan benefit. Development programs attempted to appease nationalist sentiment. Infrastructure and investment linked to political control. Education and social programs expanded selectively. Schools trained administrators and elite citizens. Curriculum encouraged loyalty and civic participation. Cultural programs reinforced French values strategically. Military reforms addressed returning colonial soldiers. Veterans integrated into security political frameworks. Military service continued to shape social mobility. Experience influenced leadership in nationalist movements. Political parties became vehicles for independence advocacy. Local leaders negotiated autonomy through structured politics. Nationalist movements gained legitimacy in electoral systems. Representation increased visibility and influence for colonial subjects. Tensions persisted between metropolitan control and nationalist ambitions. Repression and negotiation coexisted during transitional period. Political activism strengthened demands for full sovereignty. Colonial subjects asserted identity and rights increasingly. Post-war changes laid foundation for decolonization. France retained some influence, but lost absolute control. Colonial governance evolved under pressure and negotiation. Political transformation shaped mid-20th century imperial landscape permanently. Algeria launched a determined independence struggle. French rule faced organized armed resistance. Conflict lasted from 1954 to 62. War involved guerrilla tactics and large battles. National Liberation Front (FLN) led the movement. Political and military wings coordinated operations. They targeted French military and administrative presence. Aim was full sovereignty and national unity. Urban centers experienced bombing and sabotage frequently. Rural areas hosted guerrilla fighters strategically. Villages were contested between rebels and French forces. Civilian populations endured harsh conditions consistently. French army responded with overwhelming force. Counterinsurgency included military campaigns and pacification. Torture and repression were used extensively. Civilian population often suffered significant consequences. Negotiations occurred sporadically during conflict. International pressure influenced French policy gradually. UN and global opinion highlighted human rights violations. Diplomacy complemented military strategy eventually. Algerian society was deeply mobilized politically. Support networks facilitated logistics and intelligence. Women and youth participated actively. Cultural and social institutions reinforced resistance solidarity. Economic disruption accompanied armed struggle actively. Trade, agriculture, and urban services were affected. French administration struggled to maintain colonial economy. Resource allocation prioritized military over civilian needs. Media and propaganda influenced domestic and international perception. FLN communicated nationalist messages strategically. France attempted to control narrative within metropolitan press. Global awareness shaped political legitimacy of independence movement. Violence and counter-violence escalated tensions continuously. Bombings, assassinations, and massacres were common. Repression fueled further resistance and international condemnation. Conflict became symbol of anti-colonial struggle globally. Negotiations led to Evian Accords in 1962. Peace agreement granted Algeria full independence. French withdrawal concluded over a century of rule. Sovereignty restored and nationalist aspirations fulfilled. Algerian war influenced other decolonization movements worldwide. It demonstrated effectiveness of organized guerrilla resistance. Nationalist movements gained confidence from an example. Empire faced growing challenges in retaining colonies. Post-war Algeria faced reconstruction and reconciliation efforts. Society had to rebuild after extensive destruction. Political institutions were established under nationalist leadership. Nation embarked on path of self-determination. French-Algerian conflict left lasting historical impact. Legacy shaped post-colonial politics and memory. War influenced military, political, and cultural perspectives. Independence became model for other anti-colonial struggles. Vietnamese struggle against French rule lasted decades. Resistance combined political, military, and social strategies. Nationalist and communist groups led organized opposition. Goal was independence from colonial domination consistently. Early movements included petitions and local uprisings. Peasants and urban populations resisted taxation. Cultural and religious leaders supported nationalist causes. Grassroots mobilization strengthened broader political movements. Ho Chi Minh and Viet Minh emerged prominently. They coordinated military and political strategies effectively. Guerrilla warfare targeted French forces repeatedly. Support networks provided intelligence, supplies, and shelter. French army responded with force and repression. Pacification campaigns aimed to control population. Fortifications and military posts enforced colonial authority. Counterinsurgency involved both military and administrative measures. International context influenced Vietnamese resistance strategically. World War II and Japanese occupation disrupted colonial control. Allied support and global decolonization movements inspired activists. Experience shaped leadership and tactical approaches significantly. Rural areas served as revolutionary bases consistently. Villages provided manpower, food, and shelter. French attempted to undermine local support networks. Civilian populations bore significant hardships during conflict. Economic pressures fueled anti-colonial sentiment strongly. Exploitation of labor and resources created grievances. Agricultural and industrial disruption strengthened nationalist resolve. Colonial policies deepened local dissatisfaction systematically. Education and propaganda spread nationalist ideology. Schools, publications, and newspapers communicated political messages. Youth and intellectuals participated actively in movements. Awareness of global anti-colonial trends reinforced motivation. Resistance combined violent and non-violent strategies. Strikes, boycotts, and demonstrations complemented guerrilla attacks. Civil disobedience challenged colonial legitimacy peacefully. Armed struggle pressured French authority militarily. Negotiations occurred, but rarely satisfied nationalist demands. French attempted reforms to quell unrest partially. Independence aspirations remained central to Vietnamese struggle. Tensions between metropolitan promises and reality persisted. After prolonged struggle, First Indochina War erupted. Viet Minh achieved significant victories against French forces. Dien Bien Phu marked decisive turning point strategically. French defeat led to Geneva Accords in 1954. Independence was formalized, ending decades of occupation. Vietnam was partitioned temporarily into North and South. Nationalist goals partially realized through political settlements. Colonial control was replaced by self-governance structures. Vietnamese struggle inspired other anti-colonial movements. It demonstrated resilience of organized nationalist resistance. Legacy influenced Cold War dynamics regionally. National identity was strengthened through prolonged resistance. African nationalist movements gained momentum after World War II. Colonial subjects demanded political representation and self-governance. Educated elites and veterans became movement leaders. Nationalist parties organized to challenge metropolitan authority systematically. Urban centers became hubs of political activism. Trade unions, student groups, and professional associations mobilized support for independence consistently. Ideas of freedom and equality spread rapidly. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Leopold Sedar Senghor combined political, social, and cultural strategies. Pan-Africanism influenced local nationalist ideologies. Unity and identity strengthened resistance to colonial rule. Mass protests and demonstrations challenged colonial policies. Strikes and boycotts pressured administrative authorities effectively. Rural communities sometimes supported movements indirectly. Grassroots mobilization enhanced political legitimacy. Colonial governments attempted reforms to maintain control. Limited representation, advisory councils, and economic incentives. Metropoles sought to appease demands partially. Partial reforms often fueled further nationalist expectations. Media and communication networks spread nationalist messages. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and pamphlets informed population. Ideas of sovereignty and rights gained traction. Global decolonization movements inspired local efforts. Education played central role in fostering leadership. Schools and universities produced politically aware elites. Exposure to European ideas influenced strategy and ideology. Curriculum encouraged critical thinking and civic engagement. Youth and women became increasingly involved strategically. Student movements promoted political awareness consistently. Women contributed through organizations, campaigns, and protests. Participation reinforced social and political change. Violence was employed selectively by nationalist groups. Guerrilla tactics emerged in regions with strong resistance. Clashes with colonial forces demonstrated resolve and capability. Military pressure complemented political and social mobilization. International pressure supported nationalist aspirations gradually. United Nations and newly independent nations influenced policy. Global opinion condemned colonial repression strategically. External support enhanced credibility of movements. By the late 1950s, independence became increasingly achievable. Negotiations and uprisings forced metropolitan concessions consistently. Many territories transitioned peacefully or through conflict. African nationalism reshaped the continent politically and socially. Economic grievances strengthened nationalist claims repeatedly. Exploitation of resources and labor fueled discontent. Colonial taxation and trade restrictions were contested. Economic autonomy became integral to independence objectives. Cultural revival accompanied political movements deliberately. Promotion of indigenous languages, traditions, and arts. Reassertion of heritage reinforced identity and unity. Colonial cultural dominance was challenged symbolically. African nationalist movements laid foundation for post-colonial governance. Leaders assumed political office after independence. Policies reflected aspirations of self-determination and development. Decolonization reshaped social, political, and economic structures. Resistance to French colonial rule took many forms. It included violent uprisings and non-violent campaigns. Colonial subjects used strategies suited to local conditions. Both methods aimed to challenge metropolitan authority. Violent resistance involved guerrilla warfare and sabotage. Armed groups targeted military and administrative installations. Rural areas provided bases for revolutionary activity. Surprise attacks and ambushes disrupted colonial operations. Urban centers hosted strikes, protests, and demonstrations. Workers, students, and intellectuals mobilized politically. Civil disobedience challenged authority without armed conflict. Boycotts and petitions pressured colonial administrators effectively. Revolutionary movements often combined violent and non-violent tactics. Flexibility increased effectiveness against entrenched colonial power. Coordination between rural and urban activists was crucial. Movement leaders balanced risk with political objectives strategically. Military responses aimed to suppress uprisings decisively. French forces conducted raids, arrests, and executions. Counterinsurgency included intelligence, surveillance, and fortification. Repression often provoked further resistance and unrest. Propaganda supported both resistance and colonial authorities. Nationalists used media to gain support locally. French promoted loyalty and legitimacy in metropolitan press. Competing narratives shaped public perception consistently. Non-violent methods included education and cultural assertion, promoting indigenous language, customs, and traditions strategically. Schools and organizations became centers of political awareness. Cultural revival reinforced collective identity and solidarity. Violence was often targeted at symbols of authority. Administrative buildings, communication lines, and transport attacked. Destruction aimed to disrupt colonial infrastructure effectively. Operations required careful planning and local knowledge. Local populations sometimes provided intelligence and logistical support. Supply networks enabled sustained campaigns in rural areas. Civilian collaboration was essential for both forms of resistance. Participation carried risk of reprisals from colonial forces. Resistance movements inspired one another across territories. Events in Algeria, Indochina, and Africa influenced strategies. Global anti-colonial trends provided models and encouragement. Colonial subjects shared ideas and coordinated indirectly. International pressure amplified impacts of resistance activities. United Nations and foreign governments monitored human rights. Global opinion influenced metropolitan policies and negotiations. Colonial authorities faced diplomatic, as well as local pressure. Education campaigns raised awareness of political rights. Schools taught civic responsibility and nationalist ideology. Youth groups promoted political consciousness systematically. Non-violent activism complemented armed struggle effectively. Leadership played a central role in organizing resistance. Leaders negotiated, planned, and inspired participants strategically. Decisions balanced political, military, and social factors. Effective coordination determined success of campaigns consistently. Resistance ultimately weakened French control over colonies. Combined violent and non-violent pressure strained administration. Local, national, and international efforts reshaped imperial policy. Movements laid foundation for eventual independence and sovereignty. French colonial authority declined significantly after World War II. Nationalist movements and independence struggles weakened metropolitan control. Colonial governance faced political, social, and economic pressures. Empire's ability to enforce authority eroded steadily. Algeria, Indochina, and African territories challenged rule. Armed revolts, strikes, and protests became frequent. Resistance movements gained experience and coordination. Local populations increasingly questioned legitimacy of colonial power. Metropolitan France faced international pressure to reform. United Nations promoted self-determination principles globally. Global decolonization movements influenced policy decisions. Diplomatic constraints limited use of military force effectively. Economic exploitation became harder to maintain consistently. Costs of administration, military, and suppression increased. Colonies were less profitable due to resistance. Revenue shortfalls strained metropolitan finances and priorities. Returning colonial soldiers demanded rights and recognition. Veterans joined nationalist movements and political activism. Their experience and status amplified independence claims. Social pressure contributed to declining colonial compliance. Education and communication fostered political awareness locally. Literacy and global exposure encouraged demand for autonomy. Youth movements challenged traditional authority and colonial rule. Ideas of equality and self-governance spread widely. Cultural and religious institutions sometimes supported nationalism. Missionaries and schools influenced identity formation indirectly. Local elites leveraged education to negotiate authority. Colonial legitimacy was increasingly questioned publicly. French military faced protracted conflicts overseas. Algerian War, Indochina, and African rebellions drained resources. Counterinsurgency often failed to suppress nationalist movements. Military exhaustion reflected broader decline of imperial control. Political reforms were implemented partially and inconsistently. Limited representation and advisory councils were introduced. Reforms failed to satisfy nationalist aspirations fully. Colonial subjects demanded complete autonomy and independence. Metropolitan priorities shifted post-war toward reconstruction. Resources and attention were diverted from colonial administration. Political will to maintain distant empire weakened. Governance increasingly relied on compromise and negotiation. Decolonization movements accelerated in the 1950s and 1960s. Former colonies achieved independence gradually or through conflict. Empire fragmented as nationalist victories accumulated. French authority contracted geographically and politically. Loss of colonies reshaped metropolitan and global influence. Empire transitioned from direct rule to post-colonial relationships. France retained limited economic and cultural ties. Colonial decline marked end of traditional imperial power. Eager of resistance influenced post-colonial governance structures. Nationalist leaders assumed control after independence. Colonial administration models were adapted locally. Decline of authority permanently altered French global relations. Post-World War to mark start of decolonization. Colonies demanded autonomy and political participation. Nationalist movements gained momentum rapidly. Metropolitan France faced growing internal and external pressure. Global context favored independence and self-determination. United Nations promoted colonial liberation consistently. International opinion pressured France diplomatically. Decolonization became central to global political discourse. Economic strain weakened metropolitan ability to control colonies. Cost of administration and military campaigns increased. War recovery diverted resources from overseas governance. Colonial exploitation became increasingly difficult to sustain. Nationalist leaders organized political parties effectively. Urban and rural populations mobilized for independence. Labor unions, youth, and veterans participated actively. Grassroots support reinforced legitimacy of nationalist movements. Education spread political awareness among colonial subjects. Schools and universities produced informed leaders. Ideas of freedom and equality circulated widely. Colonial subjects increasingly challenged French authority publicly. Post-war reforms were limited and insufficient. Partial representation and advisory councils implemented. Metropole attempted gradual change strategically. Policies failed to satisfy nationalist demands completely. Violent and non-violent resistance shaped colonial responses. Strikes, protests, and uprisings increased pressure. Guerrilla warfare and sabotage challenged French forces. Persistence of resistance demonstrated declining colonial control. African, Asian, and Caribbean territories experienced simultaneous change. Nationalist movements inspired each other globally. Decolonization in one territory influenced neighboring regions. Momentum built toward comprehensive colonial transformation consistently. French political elites debated imperial strategy internally. Reform, negotiation, or suppression were considered. Domestic and international constraints influenced decisions. Gradual concessions sought to maintain limited influence. Colonial populations expected recognition for wartime contributions. Veterans and elites demanded rights and political roles. Unmet expectations fueled discontent and activism. Social pressure supported nationalist agendas across territories. Metropolitan policies shifted toward decolonization gradually. France acknowledged reality of nationalist demands. Transition plans included limited self-governance measures. Empire's cohesion weakened under nationalist pressure. Economic development programs attempted to placate nationalist sentiment. Infrastructure, education, and healthcare were expanded selectively. Programs aimed to demonstrate benefits of French rule. Efforts often failed to curb independence movements. Decolonization reshaped global perception of French power. Empire's decline influenced international relations significantly. Loss of colonies altered geopolitical influence permanently. French authority contracted politically, economically, and culturally. Post-war decolonization laid groundwork for eventual independence. Nationalist movements continued momentum into 1950s and 1960s. Metropole adapted through negotiation and compromise. Colonial governance faced irreversible transformation persistently. Loss of Indochina and Algeria marked major decline. French faced prolonged wars with nationalist movements. Military defeats weakened metropolitan authority severely. Colonial ambitions suffered permanent strategic setbacks. Indochina experienced First Indochina War against France. Viet Minh fought guerrilla campaigns effectively. Dien Bien Phu marked decisive French defeat. Geneva Accords formalized withdrawal and independence agreements. Algerian War of Independence was long and brutal. FLN conducted guerrilla warfare and urban attacks. French army faced protracted conflict with heavy casualties. Civilian populations endured violence and social disruption. Loss of Algeria ended over a century of rule. Evian Accords granted full sovereignty in 1962. Mass migration of European settlers occurred afterward. French political and social landscape was affected profoundly. Wars were costly economically and militarily consistently. Budget strain undermined metropolitan capacity to sustain empire. Public opinion in France turned against prolonged conflict. Political instability influenced decisions to relinquish colonies. Nationalist leadership gained legitimacy through successful resistance. FLN and Viet Minh became symbols of anti-colonial struggle. Victory inspired movements in other territories globally. Military success reinforced momentum for independence elsewhere. Colonial administration was dismantled gradually in both regions. Governance transitioned to local nationalist authorities systematically. French military and civilian personnel withdrew from territories. Infrastructure and institutions handed over to new governments. Losses influenced metropolitan policy toward remaining colonies. France shifted from direct control to negotiation and reform. Decolonization accelerated across Africa and Asia. Empire began to contract rapidly after these conflicts. International pressure supported nationalist claims strongly. United Nations and Cold War dynamics influenced outcomes. Global opinion condemned colonial repression and prolonged wars. France faced diplomatic consequences alongside military defeat. Cultural and social impacts were significant locally. Population displacement and identity shifts followed independence. Colonial society transformed under new nationalist governance. Nationalist movements shaped post-colonial political structures effectively. Experience of Indochina and Algeria informed future policy. Lessons influenced France's approach to remaining territories. Withdrawal marked turning point in imperial strategy. Empire's decline became increasingly irreversible after these losses. Legacy of conflict affected both metropolitan and colonial societies. Memory of war shaped politics, education, and culture. Loss highlighted limitations of colonial power globally. French authority was permanently weakened politically and militarily. Gradual independence of African colonies reshaped empire. Decolonization occurred mainly during late 1950s-1960s. Nationalist movements negotiated or fought for sovereignty. France faced political, social, and economic challenges. West African colonies gained independence relatively peacefully. Ghana, Senegal, and Ivory Coast negotiated transitions. Local elites assumed administrative and political roles. France retained some economic and cultural influence. Central African territories also moved towards self-governance. Democratic Republic of Congo and Gabon pursued autonomy. French authorities implemented gradual political reforms strategically. Colonial administration handed over responsibilities systematically. North African territories experienced more violent transitions. Tunisia and Morocco negotiated independence with some conflict. Algeria's war was prolonged and devastating. Violent struggle delayed transfer, but achieved eventual sovereignty. Education and political awareness fueled independence movements. Urban elites, students, and professionals advocated strongly. Youth and veterans provided leadership and organizational capacity. Grassroots participation reinforced legitimacy of nationalist campaigns. French community framework attempted to maintain ties. Colonies retained symbolic links with metropolitan France. Economic, military, and cultural connections persisted selectively. Political sovereignty was increasingly recognized despite continued influence. Elections and constitutions were drafted locally. Governance transitioned to nationalist-led administrations. French oversight reduced gradually as autonomy increased. Institutions adapted to local political and social contexts. Economic factors influenced pace of independence. Resource management, taxation, and trade policies contested. Colonial economies restructured for local control. Metropolitan interests adjusted to minimize economic disruption. International context encouraged decolonization consistently. United Nations and newly independent nations provided support. Global pressure discouraged military suppression. Colonies leveraged international legitimacy for independence claims. Gradual independence allowed France to maintain soft influence. Cultural, educational, and economic links persisted post-independence. Francophone identity reinforced continued interaction. France's global presence remained, despite territorial loss. Political negotiation reduced potential for prolonged conflict. Diplomatic solutions facilitated smoother transitions. France balanced withdrawal with preservation of strategic interests. Gradual process minimized disruption while satisfying nationalist demands. African independence movements inspired further decolonization globally. Success encouraged nationalist aspirations elsewhere. Empire contracted steadily as sovereignty expanded. Metropolitan authority diminished permanently across the continent. Legacy included new political structures and identities. Former colonies established constitutions and governments. Nationalist leaders became central to governance. France adapted to post-colonial relationships strategically. Formation of the French community was post-colonial strategy. Created in 1958 to maintain ties. Aim was to link France with former colonies. Political and economic association replaced direct imperial control. Member states gained internal autonomy gradually. France retained control over defense and foreign policy. Colonies became republics within broader French framework. Sovereignty was shared but limited strategically. Community promoted economic cooperation among member nations. Trade agreements ensured continued metropolitan influence. Shared infrastructure, investment, and aid reinforced connections. Economic links maintained France's presence in Africa. Cultural and educational programs strengthened Francophone identity. Schools, media, and universities promoted French language. Mission civilisatrice continued in softer, indirect form. Cultural diplomacy is to shape post-colonial societies. Political institutions included representative assemblies. Member states participated in advisory councils. Decisions were coordinated with metropolitan France. Authority remained weighted in favor of France. French community sought to prevent complete independence. It aimed to preserve influence peacefully. Transition to sovereignty was structured strategically. France avoided violent conflict through negotiation. Membership was voluntary, but encouraged symbolically. Economic and political incentives promoted compliance. Some territories initially reluctant, but joined gradually. Community framework balanced autonomy with continued ties. Defense arrangements integrated military cooperation. French forces provided security and training. Member states retained internal control. Metropolitan France ensured strategic military presence. Community allowed France to retain global prestige. Post-colonial relationships reflected former imperial networks. Soft power replaced direct administration effectively. France maintained influence in international affairs. Gradual reforms allowed member states greater control. Over time, former colonies asserted full sovereignty. French community acted as transitional structure. It eased the shift from empire to independence. Legacy included continued economic, political, and cultural links. Francophone networks persisted in education, trade, and diplomacy. France maintained international partnerships with former territories. Community reinforced identity without direct political domination. Formation of French community marked strategic adaptation. It represented compromise between independence and metropolitan influence. France preserved connections while relinquishing direct control. Decolonization proceeded while soft power remained active. End of formal empire occurred by mid-20th century. Most colonies achieved independence through negotiation or struggle. France retained few overseas territories under limited control. Direct colonial administration effectively ended permanently. Algeria, Indochina, and African colonies gained sovereignty. Wars and negotiations facilitated political transitions successfully. Nationalist movements ensured self-governance and territorial control. French authority contracted geographically and politically significantly. Remaining territories became overseas departments or protectorates. French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and Caribbean islands. Metropolitan France maintained strategic influence selectively. Direct rule replaced by administrative autonomy locally. Decolonization reflected global trends post-World War II. United Nations promoted self-determination principles consistently. International pressure discouraged imperial repression. Global opinion influenced metropolitan policy and strategy. Economic, political, and social ties persisted partially. Trade, culture, and education maintained connections. Francophone networks continued to operate internationally. Soft power replaced formal administrative control effectively. Wars of independence highlighted limits of colonial authority. Algeria and Indochina demonstrated military, political, and social constraints. Prolonged conflict weakened metropolitan capacity. Loss of colonies reinforced global perception of decline. Nationalist leaders assumed governance and administration. Constitutions, parliaments, and local institutions established. New nations embarked on self-determined political paths. Colonial structures were adapted to post-colonial realities. France transitioned from empire to post-colonial partnerships. Diplomatic, economic, and cultural ties continued selectively. Overseas presence shifted to cooperative relationships. Sovereignty of former colonies was recognized fully. Decline of formal empire reshaped French national identity. Political and military focus shifted to Europe and NATO. Metropolitan resources were redirected toward reconstruction. Global standing adjusted from empire to influential nation-state. Legacy of empire persisted in language, law, and culture. Francophone countries maintained links with metropolitan France. Education, media, and cultural institutions preserved influence. Colonial heritage shaped international relationships significantly. By mid-20th century, France relinquished direct rule. Colonial administration ended across Africa and Asia. Nationalist movements succeeded in establishing sovereignty. Empire transformed into cooperative networks and global influence. French language continues to influence global communication. Many former colonies speak French officially today. Education systems preserve metropolitan linguistic traditions consistently. French media and literature remain widely circulated. Cultural practices reflect historical French influence strongly. Architecture, cuisine, and art show colonial legacy. Urban planning in former colonies often mirrored France. Festivals and public rituals carry European elements. Political borders were largely shaped by colonial administration. Territorial lines often ignored indigenous ethnic divisions. Post-independent states inherited governance structures from France. Borders sometimes caused intercommunal tensions and conflicts. Legal systems in former colonies follow French models. Civil and commercial codes remain foundational today. Judicial institutions reflect metropolitan administrative practices consistently. French influence persists in bureaucratic and governance frameworks. Economic ties continue between France and former colonies. Trade agreements favor continued metropolitan involvement. Investment in infrastructure and industries maintains links. Economic cooperation is both historical and strategic. French diplomatic influence extends across Francophone nations. Former colonies maintain political and cultural alliances. France participates in international organizations alongside members. Networks reinforce shared historical and linguistic identity. Debates over colonialism's impact remain highly contested. Historians and policymakers discuss economic and social consequences. Issues of exploitation, oppression, and cultural transformation arise. Perspectives vary depending on metropolitan or local narratives. Colonial legacy affected education and social mobility. Schools reinforced French language, culture, and ideology. Elite classes benefited disproportionately from colonial structures. Social hierarchies persisted even after independence. Resistance and nationalist movements shaped post-colonial identity. Struggles against colonial rule fostered political consciousness. Leaders drew on wartime and anti-colonial experience. Sovereignty movements reshaped societal and governmental norms. French culture maintains global prominence despite empire's decline. Language, arts, and philosophy influence international discourse. Francophone culture contributes to education, literature, and media. Soft power extends through cultural diplomacy consistently. Migration patterns reinforced cultural and linguistic ties. Diaspora communities transmit French traditions abroad. Urban centers in former colonies reflect hybrid identities. Transnational networks support ongoing Francophone cultural exchange. Economic globalization linked former colonies and France tightly. French businesses operate extensively across Africa and Asia. Trade of goods, services, and resources persists strategically. Economic interdependence reflects historical colonial relationships. French legal, political, and educational systems still operate. Constitutional and administrative frameworks mirror metropolitan standards. Judicial procedures and governance continue to reflect France. Colonial influence remains embedded institutionally. Cultural institutions, such as Alliance Francaise, promote language, art, literature, and theatre preserve metropolitan heritage. Museums, libraries, and cultural centres maintain historical narratives. French cultural diplomacy strengthens international relationships systematically. Colonial borders influenced regional politics after independence. Conflicts sometimes arose from artificial divisions imposed historically. States navigated ethnic and cultural tensions shaped by empire. Boundary disputes occasionally reflect colonial-era decisions. Debates over memory and history continue actively. Monuments, museums, and curricula reflect contested perspectives. Public discourse evaluates exploitation, modernization, and transformation. Legacy is interpreted differently across generations and societies. French language and culture act as diplomatic bridges. Shared language facilitates communication, trade, and cooperation. International organizations rely on linguistic and cultural cohesion. Francophone identity fosters political and economic collaboration. Colonial experience influenced national identities in former territories. Hybrid cultures blend indigenous and European traditions. Social norms, art, and governance reflect layered influences. Identity formation was shaped by centuries of interaction. French cultural festivals remain celebrated globally. Music, theatre, and art exhibitions showcase heritage. Francophone literature and cinema reach international audiences. Global dissemination maintains metropolitan cultural prominence. Education remains a key vehicle of influence. French schools operate in former colonies consistently. Curricula teach language, history, and cultural norms. Knowledge transfer reinforces enduring metropolitan presence. Economic development projects reflect continued collaboration. Infrastructure, energy, and industry often involve French partners. Investment strengthens bilateral ties and strategic interests. Colonial networks evolved into modern economic partnerships. Debates over colonialism influence contemporary politics. Reparations, historical accountability, and social justice discussed. Scholarly work examines exploitation and modernization critically. Memory shapes policy and international relations. Legacy is complex and multidimensional. It includes language, culture, governance, and economy. Enduring French influence exists alongside local adaptation. Colonial history continues shaping global patterns. Francophone networks create shared cultural spaces globally. Conferences, alliances, and exchanges strengthen international community. Cultural diplomacy promotes cooperation and understanding. Shared heritage fosters long-term relationships consistently. Colonial history influences modern educational systems. Schools transmit metropolitan language and cultural knowledge. Higher education encourages global French-speaking cooperation. Institutions preserve continuity and historical perspective. French cuisine, fashion, and lifestyle influence societies worldwide. Colonial legacies shape taste, design, and cultural trends. Urban architecture reflects European planning principles. Daily life in former colonies retains metropolitan elements. Global media reinforces French cultural presence internationally. TV, cinema, and radio circulate Francophone content widely. Social media extends cultural influence to younger generations. French culture remains visible in global popular culture. Legacy shapes international relations and policy today. Former colonies collaborate through diplomacy and trade. Shared history provides foundation for partnerships. Cultural influence supports France's global soft power. Colonial linguistic and cultural influence remains enduring. French remains official in many international organizations. Education, law, and media reflect lasting legacy. Empire's cultural footprint continues globally and institutionally.